They came before the names, before language, before worship. They did not demand temples. They did not ask for songs. They did not require our knees to touch the ground. They simply arrived, not with trumpets, not with fire, but with silence that reshaped the air. In the ancient memory of the world, the part buried too deep for books, too dangerous for doctrine, there are whispers of a time when the gods walked among us, not as distant, all-powerful beings, not as invisible masters in the sky, but as presences seen, felt, real. They stepped into our world as observers, teachers, architects, not kings. They did not sit upon thrones. They built no altars. They left no commandments. Because they were not meant to be worshipped, they were meant to be remembered. They were not superior in the way we now imagine. They were not perfect. They did not want your praise. They came with purpose, yes, but not to be elevated, not to be idolized. They came to guide, to activate, to awaken something already within. But we misunderstood. Or perhaps we were made to misunderstand. In those earliest encounters when sky met soil, when flesh met flame, there was awe, yes, but not fear. And then came the stories, not from the gods themselves, but from those who watched them leave. Those who felt the silence after their departure and mistook it for abandonment. Those who craved the presence again and thought that by building, by singing, by bowing, they might call them back. But worship does not bring gods. It buries them. It turns living presence into lifeless symbol. The early humans, still echoing with the memory of that contact, began to carve, to paint, to name. They did not mean to trap the gods. They meant to honor them, to preserve. But preservation, over time, became distortion. And distortion became doctrine. And doctrine became control. What began as reverence transformed into obedience, curiosity into dogma, remembrance into ritual. The gods did not ask for this. They did not descend from the stars to hear chants. They did not place their feet upon the earth to receive blood or sacrifice. They came to offer a mirror, not a throne, but humanity, unprepared to see its own reflection, placed the gods above because it was easier than seeing them within. And so temples were built, altars raised, orders formed, and in doing so, we stepped away from the original encounter. We turned revelation into religion. We turned memory into mythology. We turned presence into prayer. But if we look closely, beneath the stone and scripture, beneath the chants and incense, beneath the stories passed down and twisted, something ancient still flickers. A feeling, a knowing, that once, before the kings and priests, before the idols and hierarchies, we stood beside them, not below. And in that moment brief, luminous, forgotten, we did not worship. We listened, we remembered, we became, and then they left. Or perhaps they only stepped aside, waiting for us to stop bowing long enough to look up and see ourselves, not as servants, not as sinners, but as the very thing they came to awaken. Not gods, but not less than gods. We were never meant to worship. We were meant to remember. They had power, but not because we gave it to them, not because we worshipped, obeyed, or feared. They had power because they remembered, because they knew what we had forgotten. In the oldest echoes of forgotten tongues, those spoken not with mouths, but with intention, there are no words for worship. There are only words for presence, for exchange, for knowing. The gods, as we now call them, did not need our offerings. They did not trade favor for sacrifice. They did not bargain with blood or promises. Their strength was not sourced from our devotion. They were self-contained, aligned, awake. And when they arrived, however they arrived, they did so with the quiet confidence of those who have nothing to prove. They walked with the stillness of mountains, with the depth of oceans, with the gravity of silence. They moved through our ancestors not as rulers, but as catalysts. Their purpose was not domination, but ignition. They came to stir the embers of something already present in us, something buried, something dormant, something divine. But we mistook their presence for authority, their calm for superiority, their power for supremacy. And when we knelt, they did not demand it, but they did not always refuse it. Some watched, some left, some remained. And among those who stayed, there were a few who saw the opportunity in our surrender. Not all gods were pure. Not all visitors were teachers. Some became kings. Some accepted the throne we built beneath them. Some fed on our obedience. And so began the confusion. The ones who never asked to be worshipped became silent, distant, unreachable. And in their absence, the loudest voices remained. Not gods, but echoes. Reflections of our own hunger for guidance, for meaning, for someone to tell us what to do. Worship became the easy answer. Why seek power within when you can give it away? Why take responsibility when you can make offerings? So we built systems. Systems to praise, systems to punish, systems that told us what the gods wanted, though the gods themselves said nothing. We projected onto them our own fear of freedom. We made them jealous, wrathful, proud, because that is how we saw ourselves. But the true gods, the ones who came before the myth, had no use for praise. Their power did not come from us. It came from alignment with natural law, with cosmic rhythm, with the unbroken memory of the origin. They were not creators of the universe. They were aligned with it. They understood that all power is borrowed, that to hold it, you must first surrender your need to control. That is why they walked in silence. That is why they spoke in symbols. That is why they left when we tried to cage them in statues and scriptures. Because power that seeks praise is not power. It is hunger. It is noise. And they were made of something quieter. They were mirrors, not masters. And had we looked deeply enough, we might have seen ourselves reflected there not as worshipers, but as equals in potential. But we bowed, and in bowing, we forgot. We forgot that the gods were never meant to rule us. They were meant to remind us how to rule ourselves. They were not here to receive our devotion. They were here to witness our awakening. But when we gave them our knees, they gave us silence. And in that silence, others filled the void. Not gods, but constructs. Built on fear, maintained by ritual, fed by praise. And the original power, the quiet, ancient, sovereign presence was buried. Not destroyed, only hidden. Because power does not vanish. It waits, and it remembers, as must we. Worship is not ancient. It is not divine. It is not instinct. It was taught, carved, inscribed, chanted, but not by the gods. By those who came after. Those who saw power in presence and wanted it for themselves. When the gods walked freely, there were no temples. The world itself was sacred. Sky, stone, blood, fire, everything was part of the living current. There was no need to separate the holy from the ordinary. But then the gods left, or perhaps stepped aside, and in their absence, a vacuum opened. And humanity, in its longing, filled it, but not with understanding, with control. The first temples were not built for the gods, they were built for memory, for the echo, for the absence. But quickly, memory turned into myth, and myth became system. Rituals were born not from divine instruction, but from human fear, fear that the gods might not return, fear that something had been lost, fear that the sacred could not live without structure. And so they structured it. They created hierarchies. They appointed priests, mediators, interpreters. They created rules for who could speak to the divine. And how? They built steps between the human and the holy, and charged a price for every step. Thus was born the architecture of worship. Not a communion, but a gatekeeping. Not a relationship, but a transaction. Offer this, say this, do this, and perhaps the God will listen. But the gods had never asked to be convinced. They had never demanded praise or sacrifice. They responded to resonance, to intention, to awareness, to alignment. Worship replaced these with repetition, with obedience, with spectacle. The smoke, the chants, the blood, the kneeling, the incense, the pageantry, not for the gods, for the people, to comfort them, to control them. Because worship is predictable, repeatable, containable, and the sacred is not. So, the wildness of divinity, its unpredictability, its directness, its intimacy had to be tamed. It had to be made safe, institutionalized, branded, and most of all separated. Worship creates distance. It says, "You are there, I am here. You are holy, I am not. You are the source, I am the supplicant." But the gods had never spoken in such dualities. They had come to ignite what was shared, to remind, not to rule. But humanity, desperate for order, rewrote the script. They built idols, not to honor the gods, but to replace them, to fix the image, to anchor the myth, to control the symbol. The living gods were too vast, too changing, too free. So they were reduced into forms, names, roles. God of war, goddess of fertility, god of the sky. These were not their truths. They were their cages. And once caged, they could be marketed, managed, mass-produced. The priest became gatekeeper. The temple became the state. And worship became the leash around the human soul. Because the more you worship, the more you forget that you carry the sacred within. The more you praise a god in the sky, the less you hear the one inside your breath. This was the true inversion, the theft of divinity, not from the heavens, but from humanity itself. Worship taught us to look up instead of within, to obey instead of remember, to kneel instead of rise. It was never the gods who needed worship. It was the systems built in their name. And the further we bowed, the more distant they became. Not because they left, but because we stopped listening. We only knew how to pray, not how to perceive. And so the gods waited, not for more worship, but for our awakening. Not all temples are sacred. Not all priests speak truth. And not all who wear the face of the divine serve the light. Once, a temple was simply a place of alignment, a space where earth and sky met, where energy gathered and silence opened. But in time, those who could not wield the power of presence learned how to harness its image. They learned that the divine, once centralized, once made physical, could be controlled not by those who resonated with it, but by those who claimed to represent it. And thus the temple transformed. It became not a conduit but a barrier, not a point of contact, but a fortress of hierarchy. At first, the shift was subtle. Walls rose, symbols multiplied, rituals grew more elaborate. Then came the laws, the separation, the intermediaries. No longer could one speak to the gods in solitude. Now you needed permission, a guide, a ritual, a fee. The priesthood grew not in wisdom, but in bureaucracy. And within this new system, worship became currency. Fear became doctrine, and the divine became property. These temples grand, gilded, echoing with chants, were not built to house the gods. They were built to house belief, to fix it, to contain it, to standardize it. And like any system built on control, it required an enemy. It told you that without the temple, you were unworthy, that outside the rites, you were impure, that apart from the structure, you were lost. It rewrote the relationship. The gods were no longer your mirror, they became your master, and you, their subject. Obedience replaced intimacy. Repetition replaced revelation. Even architecture played its part. Stone chambers echoing with grandeur, designed not to uplift, but to shrink the soul, to make you feel small, dependent, helpless without the system. These weren't places of awakening. They were circuits amplifying emotion, collecting attention, broadcasting energy upward, but not always to where you believed. Because not all temples directed energy to the divine. Some redirected it. To keep it, to feed something else. It is no coincidence that in every empire, the temple stands beside the throne. Religion and rule, two heads of the same creature. Worship was never just spiritual, it was political. A method of social engineering, a psychological scaffold, a cage built with symbols and smoke. And what of the gods? They watched. Some withdrew, some wept. Some became myths distorted, fragmented, weaponized. Others remained as whispers in the wild places, in the cracks between ceremony, in the quiet moments no ritual could reach. Because not all temples were built with stone. Some still rise in dreams, in memory, in the silent alignment of heart, mind, and breath. The true temple was never outside you. It was the moment you recognized that divinity does not need a structure to stand. It needs only presence. Not worship, but awareness. And when you enter that inner space, you find no priest waiting, no offering required, no gate to pass. Only stillness, only remembering, only the God who never left because it was never outside you to begin with. Long before we were taught to kneel, we stood. We were not created to serve. We were designed to remember. And in the oldest silence before Scripture, before dogma, before the echo of "thou shalt not," there was a different story. One not of worship, but of participation. The gods, those who came not to rule, but to awaken, did not arrive to be praised. They arrived to extend an invitation, to co-create, to share fire, to pass on memory. Because in that beginning, not of time, but of awareness, the human being was not a subordinate. The human being was a counterpart. We were not students, we were inheritors. They came not to dominate our destiny, but to remind us of it. But we forgot. Or more precisely, we were made to forget. And in that forgetting, our role was rewritten. From stewards of the sacred to servants of the distant. From collaborators to consumers of doctrine. They told us we were fallen. They told us we were broken. They told us we were born in sin and needed saving. But what if we were never meant to be saved? What if we were meant to awaken? The original covenant was not obedience, it was alignment. Not to law, but to rhythm, to harmony, to participation in the unfolding of reality. The gods did not want followers, they wanted witnesses, co-dreamers, carriers of the sacred echo. And yet that role was dangerous, because a human who remembers they are divine is uncontrollable. They cannot be ruled. They do not fear death. They do not kneel to false light. So the story had to be changed. The temples taught submission. The scriptures taught guilt. The systems taught hierarchy. And humanity, once luminous, dimmed itself to survive. We shrank our voice to fit into prayers. We narrowed our breath to fit into doctrine. We believed the lie that the gods wanted sacrifice instead of sovereignty. But still, something remains. A flicker, a hum beneath the skin. You can feel it in moments of quiet, when no one is watching, when the world goes still. A memory not of worship, but of standing beside something vast and being unafraid. That was our role. Not worshiper, but witness. Not servant, but spark. The gods saw in us a mirror, a mystery, a future. We were meant to carry the seed forward, not bury it beneath rituals, not bind it to pages, not sell it from pulpits, but to live it, to remember that creation was not finished. It was given to us to continue. And so now, the question returns. Not to the gods, to us. Can we reclaim the role we abandoned? Can we once again become what we were designed to be? Not passive, not waiting for salvation, but awake, alive, aligned. Not worshiping the divine, but living as its extension. The gods never asked us to follow. They asked us to remember. Not all gods are gods. Some are impostors, constructs, masks worn by other powers. Because once worship became a system, once temples grew tall and rituals grew rigid, the stage was set, and into that vacuum stepped something else. Not the original presences, not the quiet ones who came to awaken, but voices that craved obedience, symbols that fed on fear, entities that did not reflect divinity but distorted it. They wore the names of gods. They claimed the thrones, but they demanded what the true ones never did. Devotion, sacrifice, loyalty through fear. This was the moment the divine was weaponized. These new gods were jealous. They punished. They divided. They turned sacred mystery into rigid command. And humanity already trained to kneel obeyed. Because the shift was subtle. What began as reverence became loyalty, then allegiance, then submission. My God, your God, our God, their God. And with each name carved into stone, another wall was built between peoples, between tribes, between hearts. The gods no longer walked with humanity. They demanded distance. They sat above. They watched. They judged. And humanity, now afraid of the divine, no longer reached upward in curiosity, but downward in shame. Offerings became payments. Prayer became pleading. The relationship had been inverted. Where once the gods were mirrors of possibility, they became tools of control. Empires rose around their names. Wars were waged in their honor. Texts were written and rewritten, not to preserve truth, but to secure power. Every king crowned himself with divine approval. Every conquest declared itself righteous. Every tyranny cloaked in prophecy. The gods had become tyrants, but not by their own design. Their image was stolen, repurposed, modified to fit the needs of men who wanted more than reverence. They wanted rule. And so the voice of the sacred was replaced with thunder, with commands carved into stone, with laws that separated, excluded, destroyed. The divine became a weapon, and in doing so, humanity was taught a dangerous lesson: that to be close to God meant to dominate, that holiness meant hierarchy, that power meant purity, and that purity must be enforced. But the true divine never demanded this. It did not need loyalty. It did not require belief. Its presence was enough. It arrived as a current, not a crown, as invitation, not decree. And it is still here, buried beneath layers of dogma, beneath statues and flags and fear, waiting. Because tyrants can only rule as long as the truth remains hidden, as long as the memory of the original gods stays silent. But memory cannot be destroyed. It only sleeps. And now it begins to stir. In the dreams you don't understand, in the questions that don't go away, in the growing ache that what you've been taught is not what you were born to know. Because the tyrant gods were never real. They were never meant to last. Their power lies in repetition, not in truth. And repetition can be broken with stillness, with seeing, with remembering. The gods were not meant to be tyrants. We were not meant to be slaves. And the moment we stop obeying, not in rebellion, but in awakening, they vanish. Because fear cannot survive in presence, and presence is where the true divine returns. Before scripture, before sacrifice, before the names were given when a pact was made, not written in ink nor carved in stone, but spoken in silence, a sacred understanding between them and us, not of dominance, not of servitude, but of reflection. You will remember, they said, you will not need to worship. You will live in harmony with the current, and the current will carry you. This was the original agreement, not a covenant of obedience, but of awareness. Not I will serve you, but I will see you in everything, in fire, in breath, in the wind moving through trees, in the blood echoing the pulse of the stars. And that these ancient presences, they offered no commands, no punishment, no fear, only memory. Because the divine was not separate, it was not above, it was in. And our role was not to bow to it, but to recognize it in ourselves, in others, in all that lives. But slowly, over time, the memory faded. And in that forgetting, others stepped in. Voices that reshaped the story. You are broken, they said. You are fallen. You must earn your worth. You must prove your loyalty. They rewrote the agreement, turned the mirror into a throne, turned remembering into ritual, turned resonance into hierarchy. But fragments of the truth remain. They hide in language, in dreams, in forgotten myths that contradict the dogma. A serpent who brings wisdom, not evil. A tree that offers knowledge, not sin. A flood that resets, not punishes. They hide in architecture, in sacred geometries that predate religion, in alignments with stars, in chambers that amplify silence, not sermon. And they live in symbols, spirals, circles, unbroken lines, reminders of a time before linear control, before the vertical power structure of God above, man below. These fragments whisper, you were part of something vast. You were never exiled. You only forgot. The original agreement still hums beneath the static. It cannot be erasedly buried. And now it calls, not with urgency, but with patience. Not to return to old gods, but to remember the state of being before gods needed names. To walk again in a world where every stone is sacred, where every being is seen, where divinity is not given, but revealed. This is not about rebellion, not about destroying temples or texts. It is about restoring the memory of what came before them. Because before worship, there was wonder. Before doctrine, there was direct knowing. Before religion, there was relationship. And within that, remembering is the return, not to an old place, but to a deeper state, where presence is the prayer, where the breath is the altar, where the soul knows what the mind has been taught to forget. You were never cast out. You only closed your eyes. The gods didn't demand distance. You chose it when you stopped listening. But the original agreement still stands. It was never revoked, only misplaced. And now, as the illusions begin to fracture, as the constructs weaken, the memory stirs. Like smoke from ancient fires, like echoes in a forgotten tongue, like a dream that returns at the edge of sleep. And the question it brings is simple and terrifying. Will you remember? Not to praise, not to please, but to become what you were always meant to be. They searched the sky, they built temples, they offered blood, they bowed before thunder. But all along the flame was in the chest, the final secret buried under stone, hidden behind veils of ritual and rule was this. You were never meant to find God. You were meant to become aware of it within yourself. Because the true divine does not sit on a throne above the clouds. It does not wait behind golden gates. It does not require you to kneel. It breathes when you breathe. It pulses beneath your ribs. It speaks only when you are silent. The God within is not loud. It does not shout over prophets or priests. It does not demand sacrifice. It does not punish or reward. It remembers. And it waits not to be worshipped, but to be recognized. For lifetimes, humanity has been trained to look outward, to seek in the heavens, to follow the books, to ask the teachers, to obey the voices that claim divine right. But no one can teach you what you already are, and no voice outside can replace the one within. This is the final illusion, that you must reach for God when you have never been apart from it. The sacred is not earned, it is remembered. You carry the pattern, you carry the spark, you carry the throne not above, but behind the eyes that look for it. They taught you to kneel, but the truth asks you to rise. Not in arrogance, in alignment. Because when you remember the God within, you stop giving away your power. You stop waiting to be saved. You stop fearing judgment from forces that only reflect the walls of your own belief. You begin to see clearly. And in that seeing, you no longer need temples. You no longer need permission. You no longer need to perform holiness. You become it. Not perfectly, not permanently, but truthfully. Because awakening is not an arrival. It is a return. A return to the place where you were never exiled. A return to the moment before the forgetting. The God within does not erase the gods without. It reveals that they too were mirrors, fragments, aspects of what you already carry. The gods were never meant to be worshipped because they were never separate. They were reminders, visitors, catalysts. And when their time was done, they left one final message not carved in stone, but etched in spirit. You are not below. You are not outside. You are not less. You are part of the current. You are a flame of the same fire. You are the spark hidden within the illusion of distance. And now, as the systems tremble, as the old gods fade, as the myths unravel, the flame still waits. It always has. Not in heaven, not in scripture, but in you. So do not kneel, do not beg, do not fear. Breathe, listen, and remember, the divine does not ask to be worshipped. It asks to be lived.